Brilliant. Thank you very much. Lastly, can you just describe the life of a director in one word? Yeah.
Exhilarating.
Dan Ashworth is one of the most highly respected sporting directors in Britain, but why? How has he built such a stellar reputation? In this video, we're going to explore his career path and successes he's had along the way, and why he's widely considered the best-in-class option to become Manchester United's first true director of football. It was in 2000 when Ashworth was appointed academy director at Peterborough before he moved through Cambridge, and then in 2004 he moved on to West Brom. And he was brought in to revolutionise the club's academy alongside Adi Boothroyd. When Boothroyd left the club after a short spell, Ashworth took over as the youth team manager, and then in 2007 he became the club's technical director and was left in charge of 4 departments: the men's first team, recruitment, the academy, and the medical and sports science team, with the logic being that if the manager left, the club wouldn't collapse behind the scenes.
My view, our view, is that if you keep changing the head coach every sort of 14 months or so, which I think is about the average lifespan of a manager, unfortunately, nowadays, and then you go from one philosophy to the other, you've got no chance of joining up your loans, your academy, your development programme, and your player recruitment. You end up having to change 16, 17, 18 players in order to change the principles and philosophies. So it's about a long-term plan in order to get the best out of the resources we have at Brighton.
And Ashworth was in control of those. Speaking about Dan Ashworth, Tony Mowbray said that he was the glue that made everything else at the club stick together. And he said that Dan took a lot of the burden off him. He'd even called Jeremy Pearce a bit of a visionary for appointing him. Now, during his time at West Brom, Dan Ashworth was credited for being a bit of a recruitment whiz, and is said to have watched around 300 matches per season during his time at the club, and he's credited with making bargain signings like Graham Dorrans, Yusuf Malumbu, Claudio Jacob, and Jonas Olsson, amongst many others. And in his 5 seasons there as technical director, West Brom established themselves as a Premier League club, and that brought him to the attention of the FA. In 2012, Ashworth was appointed as the FA Director of Elite Development and is largely credited with the success with the England DNA programme, which was geared towards the youth teams. And during his time, the England under-17s and under-20s became world champions, and the under-19s became European champions. Some serious successes. And speaking about his working relationship with Dan Ashworth, Mike Rigg, who was the FA's head of talent management, said this in 2018. When Dan went in, it would not be unfair to say that the FA were not fulfilling their potential. What has happened since has been absolutely down to the vision and strategic intelligence of what Dan Ashworth has brought to the organisation. Dan was pretty much derided in certain circles for implementing the DNA he was scoffed at. But it was that concept of the DNA and the attention to detail contained within it that has brought the national team together. 5 years ago, not many from within the game looked to the FA as a model for best practice. Everyone was doing those study trips abroad. Everyone did the Ajax trip and the Barcelona trip. Now, people from all over the world are coming to St George's Park to see what the FA are doing. Dan is responsible for putting that in place.
I think it's really important to have a vision. And so that's normally set by the board, but have something that is a vision, a target that people can aspire to and align to. And then once you've got your vision, it's about setting a plan where everybody can feel part of that plan. So you should be able to say that you're the under-9 coach, for example, and your role in helping Newcastle achieve that plan is X or Y.
So his early successes at West Brom caught the attention of the FA. And when he completed his time there with the FA, he moved on to Brighton, where he had some of his best successes. He resigned from his role with the FA in 2018 and took the role of technical director at Brighton only a few months later. And do you remember that he was in charge of 4 departments at West Brom? Now he was in charge of 7 different departments at Brighton. The men's first team, the women's first team, recruitment, loans, academy, the medical and sports science, the psychology, and the mental well-being. He really was the centre of the wheel, which is exactly how he describes himself.
Yeah, so technical director's role is always best described as sort of looking after the interests of the club in a medium to long term. You know, my job is not at 12:30 today, you know, tactical systems or anything like that. You know, that's Graham's job. He's the head coach in order to do that.
And it's fair to say that Dan Ashworth was one of the crucial cogs in a Brighton setup which gained a reputation around the world. The likes of Moises Caicedo being spotted and signed, the likes of Marc Cucurella. Potter was the right manager, they were making the right signings, and Brighton were making all the right noises as a modern-day football club who were maximising their potential.
The vision for Tony is to be a top 10 Premier League club. Now, that's a difficult thing. You know, there's a lot of other clubs that are either in those positions at the moment or, you know, have got maybe more resources than us in order to build that. So it's about thinking a little bit differently, about producing young players, maybe recruiting a little bit differently, and making our resources stretch a little bit further to ultimately try and get the club into a situation where we can compete into the top 10.
And that is what gained him such a reputation at Brighton, that built on everything that he did with the FA, and why he got the attention of Newcastle. And in February 2022, Dan Ashworth was confirmed as a sporting director of Newcastle, whose new owner saw him as the main man to steer that project. And at Newcastle, he was now in charge of 9 departments. And the additional departments that he was in control of were the football operations overall and data and analytics. Now, when it comes to recruitment, which Ashworth has had some serious success in, he's always used a 3-pronged traffic light system. Number 1, the recruitment department have a vote. Number 2, the financial package has to make sense. And number 3, the head coach has a vote. If all 3 return green lights, the club could go ahead with that transfer.
There is no point, in my view, the technical director or sporting director overruling the manager on a player that's in the 22, 23-man first team squad. Because if they do and the manager doesn't want them, they're not going to play them. So that becomes a waste of money.
And it'll be interesting to see if he used that same sort of logic overall if he came in at Manchester United. And how heavily involved he would be. Maybe if we got someone like Paul Mitchell as a head of recruitment underneath him too. But as Ashworth has progressed in his career, he's doing less and less direct involvement with transfers. This is what a former colleague said. He doesn't do a lot of scouting players. He does do negotiations, but he'll rely on people he trusts to find good players and then on himself to negotiate well. If people underneath him recommend bad players, he will not be vetoing deals. So Ashworth builds the team around him that he trusts, so he delegates those responsibilities, and delegation is a big thing that needs to happen at United. So throughout his time from Peterborough and Cambridge to West Brom to the FA to Brighton to Newcastle, Dan Ashworth has built a fantastic reputation. At different levels, starting off only controlling 4 departments at West Brom to 7 at Brighton to 9 at Newcastle, he's the man who sees himself at the centre of the wheel, and at United, we need to reinvent the wheel. And maybe Dan Ashworth can be the centre of that under INEOS with the likes of Jean-Claude Blanc as a CEO, maybe with Paul Mitchell as a head of recruitment, with Dave Brailsford as more of a chairman, and Jim Ratcliffe as a co-owner. Ashworth has really done it all. In terms of what we are looking for in a sporting director, who better to look at than arguably Britain's first real true sporting director in Ashworth. Everton's sporting director Kevin Thelwell even went one step further. He said that he is the best director of football this country has ever produced. Dan Ashworth has a preference for and a proven track record for creating an environment to develop young players, which is a non-negotiable for anybody at United. And given that we just won the FA Youth Cup, given that our under-18s and our under-21s are in the best condition that we have been in a long time, creating that pathway to the first team is so important. And at Brighton, it was believed that one of Ashworth's biggest influences was on creating that pathway into the first team. And a really good example of that was in the 2020-21 season, Brighton had a goal of reaching 30% of their Premier League minutes were coming from academy players. And they absolutely achieved that with the likes of Robert Sanchez, Aaron Connolly and Ben White all establishing themselves in the first team. And with the likes of Shea Lacey, Dan Gore, Willie Cambuala and lots more coming through at United, that pathway is a huge opportunity for the club to find some real stars. The transfer systems he's had in place at separate clubs have all shown they have had success. The likes of Alexis McAllister, Karim Matoma, Tino Livramento, Moises Caicedo, Yves Bissouma, Tariq Lamptey, Sven Botman. He really does have an excellent record, and that bodes well for a United which is desperate to reinvent our recruitment. And on top of all of that, being a manager, a lot of it is human interaction, relationships, and the interpersonal skills of Ashworth are something that people who have worked with him really credit. This is what Tony Mowbray once said about him. Dan's very good at bringing people together and getting the maximum out of everything and everyone. He dilutes conflict and oils the machine to make it run seamlessly. And Mike Rigg, who worked with him at the FA, said it's not about power and control for Dan. That's one of his key qualities. He gets the best from others without micromanaging. He gets the best from everyone around him. It's no exaggeration to say that Dan Ashworth has been a bit of a pioneer when it comes to sporting directors in this country. His own personal philosophy of developing young talent is a perfect fit with United. And just as importantly as that, he has a track record for creating environments where others can thrive and for managing both teams and individuals on both a personal level and a team management level. And United need all of that wrapped up into one. We don't just need somebody who's great at spotting players. We don't just need somebody who is great at creating a pathway for youth players or creating a culture at a club, or we need everything. We need somebody who can take charge of every part of Manchester United's football operation. And honestly, if you look at the track record of Dan Ashworth and you look at the way that he's grown up until this point, look, Brighton had him poached by Newcastle. That's a step up in the size of the club. It could well be the case that the same thing happens to Newcastle. Manchester United come in, Dan Ashworth comes to our club and becomes our first true football director. And with Jean-Claude Blanc as a CEO, maybe Paul Mitchell underneath as the head of recruitment, and everybody working together with Ten Hag under Ratcliffe, and all football operations going away from the Glazers, maybe this really is United taking our first steps into the modern era. The first real rebuild post-Fergie. And it could well be that Dan Ashworth becomes the centre of that wheel as far as football operations go.